How are you doing? This is Tony Dubiel, Solution Architect for Cisco Cloud and Managed Services Organization. Today I will provide you with a brief demo of Cisco OpenStack Private Cloud, and I will demo the ability of spinning up a net new instance into Cisco OpenStack Private Cloud. And part of the demo will be to point out how simple it is to bring up a net new virtual machine. So the user interface that you see here represents an end user and the access that they would have to the system. So in Cisco OpenStack Private Cloud, it is a fully multi-tenant cloud environment built on top of OpenStack. And in this construct, an administrator can allocate to a user the privilege to log into a particular project or into multiple projects. A project would be synonymous with a tenant environment. In this tenant environment, the end user or users would be allocated a finite amount of resources that they could potentially request additional resources later. So what we see here in an overview would be the project and the quotas that have been assigned to the project. What a quota means is that we have a maximum amount of resources. So from an instances perspective, we can have a maximum of 10 in this particular project. From a virtual CPU, we have 20 vCPUs available. We've used 6. RAM, we have 51,000 megs, and floating IPs, we have 4 that we've consumed, and we have 6 available. And what those IPs are IPs that are used to net the private IP addressing within this tenant environment to a public IP address that would become internet facing. And then security groups would provide us with access control lists so that we can control which sources can access our virtual machine as a destination, and we can prevent or allow for specific ports to be accessed on these virtual machines. This is where we configure an instance, but we'll table this for a second and we'll take a look at some of the other components that typically we would need to build first before we actually launch the instance in Cisco OpenStack Private Cloud dashboard. So one of the areas is that we would want to establish those security groups. So that's what you see here as security groups. We'll take a look at one. This one, Puppet, which I configured earlier for a demo that represented Puppet configuration management toolset. If we go in and manage that access control list, we can see that I allowed for certain ports to be accessed from the virtual machine in this project environment. And I'm allowing any remote IP address, but I could make this more granular and include particular subnets that would map to these ports. So this is an example of an access control list. Another thing that we saw here in access and security is the ability to create key pairs. So this is the key pair that I'm using that I would download into my laptop in order to be able to SSH into this instance. Once we power it on and instantiate it into the system, we would use this particular key for the SSH. Floating IPs can be allocated from access and security as well. As I mentioned earlier, these are public IP addresses that are internet facing. And then we have API access. So with API access, we can use that as an alternative to configure virtual machines in a project versus using the dashboard. And what you see here is an enhanced version of the Horizon dashboard. Horizon dashboard being part of an OpenStack project, which also underneath the hood would connect to an API. So you log in, you create a token, you use the dashboard, you make changes. Those changes are being enforced into OpenStack with access through an API. With API access, we also have alternatives to use command line interface toolsets. Other types of REST API tools from browsers and other systems, curl scripts, Python, a multitude of tool sets that can take advantage of that API access. And for a particular project, a URL is created with a specific port, and then we would provide access to the API by being able to download the credentials, these files, into your laptop or into another external system. And then that would provide you with a tool set to authenticate and to use as an alternative versus the dashboard. And what I'm going to do is create subsequent demos that represent some examples of these other tools. Now what we're going to do is see what it would look like again from the dashboard perspective. So let's go to instances. And another area too, just to touch on briefly, is images. So before we bring up an instance, we would really need to decide what type of image that we want to use to build the virtual machine, the guest operating system, etc. So in images, we have some options where we can use multiple different types of formats to create an image. In this case, I imported a few virtual machines that I created an image and maintained the VMDK virtual disk file format from VMware, but I could have certainly have converted it before importing it to another format like QCal or RAW. And an example of RAW here above, you see a snapshot. So the advantage of a snapshot is that I can take an existing virtual machine in Cisco OpenStack Private Cloud and I can clone it and create a copy that I can use as a snapshot to spin up additional virtual machines later, using that as my image to launch the virtual machine. So to launch a virtual machine, what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and go to instances and launch instance. Our availability zone in this lab environment is trial 2. That is the only option that we have available. In a customer production environment, they may have multiple availability zones. We'll give it a name. A flavor is an instance type. So these are sizings. One advantage of Cisco OpenStack Private Cloud versus, say, an alternative like an AWS or an Azure is that you have the ability to build as many flavors to represent instance types so that you can customize the amount of CPU, memory, storage, etc., to make a purpose-built sizing for a particular application. These are ones that are pre-configured. If I needed additional capabilities, I could jump into an administrator account and I could create an additional instance type to use for my particular virtual machine environment. What we'll use is M1 small. We can decide to create one or multiple virtual machines. In this case, we'll just go ahead and spin up one of those. And now the important part is to find that image. And again, we can boot from image, from a snapshot, from a volume. We have, multiple options at our disposal. So from the images, I can find the existing images. We have several guest operating systems, both Linux and Windows is in here. And what I'm going to do is use this Puppet agent instance, image rather. Again, we can see our project limits that I spoke to earlier in terms of a quota and what we have available to us. And before I launch, I have a few options here again to select the type of security group, and then I could run a script post instance spin up, and I have other options as well for partitioning of the disk and so on. So what I'm going to do is go back to details and launch that instance, and you can see it here, demo video. It's spawning, and this will take a few minutes to copy the image and to power up into my project. No state yet. Let's go ahead and refresh the screen. Okay, now we can see that it is running. So the next thing that we can do is we can go to the console, and an advantage of Cisco OpenStack Private Cloud is that the console is web-based. There are no dependencies on Java, as is the case with VMware and vSphere. So from the console, we can see that our CentOS 6.3 is booting up, and we can log in. Okay, so now we have a running Linux operating system, guest operating system in a Cisco OpenStack private cloud instance. Thank you for your time today, and please stay tuned for other demos to follow.